All right, shall we get started? So my name is Chris Evans. I am the Vice President of Academic Affairs here. And Dr. Ludwig is the President. So we want to welcome everybody here. Meetings. Now, I need to start with the disclaimer. I'm trained as a theologian, and in all my years of training, I've been taught to sacrifice style for clarity. Right. So when James asked me to come and do the introductions, I enthusiastically said, no way. So ask George, he's a musicologist. He understands beauty and style. But here I stand. So I think wasn't about a year and a half ago, I met with Joshua and James, and they laid out their vision for a Catholic MFA program. And they wanted to start it at UST. And to that invitation, I was like, yeah, that was an immediate yes. And in some ways, it intuitively speaks to who we are as a university. The Basilians started UST 75 years ago this year, and they sought to form students with cultural subjects in which theology and philosophy understandably had a special place. But interesting enough, along these instruments of wisdom, they also valued the place of literature. It's a very unique Basilian thing. And they balanced their curriculum with courses in philosophy, theology, and English as core of the core. And I think the reason is not difficult to imagine. There is, after all, potential in literature to increase one's capacity to discover the truth and the unity of it in Jesus Christ, to understand it and articulate it in a compelling way, in a way which I think Joshua called most recently a commitment to, quote, cultivating a rhetorical adherence to the glory. The program offers something new. An opportunity for a great legacy is exciting. And the story of the Catholic literature in America, we hear today Dana, Joya's cry, or a recovery or a renaissance. And James and Joshua have taken up that call, and they identified UST as the place for it. Now, if they succeed, their names will long be remembered, but so will UST. This is where it all got started, right? So on this special evening, I'm honored to welcome everyone for a fiction reading by Joshua Hren and a poetry reading by James Matthew Wilson. And I also invite everyone to stay for reception, for libation and fellowship. And now let me introduce our speakers. James Matthew Wilson is the founding director of a new MFA program here at the University of St. Thomas. The author of 10 books, he serves also as poet in residence of the Benedict XVI Institute for Sacred Music and Divine Liturgy, poetry editor of Modern Age magazine, and a series editor for Colosseum Books of St. Franciscan University Press. Twice, Wilson has been awarded the Lionel Basney Award from the Conference on Christianity and Literature, the Catholic Media Awards Book Award for Poetry, and the Hyatt Prize from the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Poetry. Joshua Hren is Assistant Professor of the Humanities and co-founder of the MFA program in creative writing. Joshua's published 7 books, including 2 collections of short stories and his first novel, and mine just came in today, Infinite Regress. The founder of Wise Blood Books, Joshua's fiction has received honorable mention from the Conference on Christianity and Literature's Annual Book Award and also a Catholic Media Awards 2020 Book Award. Now, please join me in welcoming James Matthew Wilson to talk more about the program.
I just wanted to open up the evening with a few words about this program, and then I'm going to turn things over to Joshua to give us a reading, and then I'll wrap up the evening with a short reading from Poems of My New Book. So thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. It's an honor to be here. Every moment since this program was first conceived feels like a great grace, because it didn't have to be done, and yet it had to be done the way Providence works. And in fact, I wanted to start with that. When I think back to my first years as an aspiring poet and sending out poems to small magazines and hoping someone would take one, the general thought that I had was, I just hope someone's willing to say that what I had done was sufficiently acceptable that they give it a little space in the magazine. When we conceived this program, the feeling or the sense, maybe even the anxiety, could not have been more different. When you send your work out to editors across the world, you're just hoping somebody will give you a shot. Here, we knew that something needed to be done, and we knew how it needs to be done, and we knew that the world wanted it. And boy, it was so rewarding as the months began to unfold after we announced the program, to find application after application, inquiry after inquiry, email after email from people saying, this is what I was looking for, and I had despaired of ever finding it. Why is that? I think the answer is at least, well, why don't we say threefold, because I want to get a chance to mention that. So first one is in 2013, Dana Joya, the former poet laureate of California, former chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, and in my book, the most important thing, the greatest advocate of a revival of poetic form in the last 50 years in the United States, said Catholics represent roughly a quarter of the American population, and yet our presence in public culture, in public life, in the arts is practically negligible. Now, first of all, he knew that that was quite true, and that it was just going to get people's hackles up. And boy, did it get people's hackles up, in the best sense possible. Writers who indeed were serious Catholics, writers who were at least tortured or haunted by Christ, as Flannery O'Connor might have said, realized that they were not taking seriously enough the spiritual inheritance that had made their art possible. And so at Dana's goading, these people began to attend to what the church had given them and what they could give to the church in a more serious and deliberate manner. But there's more to be said. I think if one looks out on the landscape of the contemporary arts and letters, one sees, I live in the Midwest, one sees a very flat horizon, one that maybe even defies southern India or central India. That is to say, the secular, to just coin a term for it, the secular tends to flatten, but people do not turn to the great books of our tradition. They don't turn even to the most casual novel merely to encounter a flat landscape. They rather turn to books. They rather open a book of poems and read a poem because they want to encounter a mystery. They want to encounter a sense that reality has more burrowed into it than can be captured in many commercials. And so the arts, the world of literature needs this program more than this program needs the world of the arts. And so we are so glad to have this opportunity to bring aspiring and in many cases already accomplished in publishing writers together with a true sense of vocation and mission to try to give to the world, to feed the world with what it really needs, which is a literature that actually answers the deep aspirations of the human spirit to understand human experience and its relationship to the great order of creation and to the one who created it. But finally, there's a third reason. The church itself is intended to be all of mankind under the reign of Christ. And all of mankind under the reign of Christ is a phenomenon, is a reality that cannot be understood purely in terms of goodness, of morality, or in terms of truth, of sound doctrine. It needs to be understood in both those terms and in terms of beauty. And I think every Catholic and indeed every Christian and even people far outside of the church understand this. Nobody goes and visits Notre Dame. Well, you can't now, I'm afraid, but nobody went to visit Notre Dame and said, oh, nice building. Everyone goes there for a sense of awe. They may not know why they're there. They may not know what that awe means, but they know that it's significant. And the church is here to save every person, including those people who are so estranged from truth and goodness that only the rare niggling or tug at their elbow of an encounter with beauty can still reach them. And so for the sake of the church, we also wanted to found this program. Not because the church needs us the way the world, I think, needs great literature, but because the church of its own intrinsic nature wants to give birth to great works of beauty. Everyone probably knows the great line from Benedict XVI that he says, the church's works of art and its saints are its greatest testimony. I think that line's often reinterpreted, or misinterpreted, but I think there's something really beautiful and true about what says there. And so we're hoping that in the years ahead, our program will both give a broader representation to the presence of Catholics in American culture and world culture. We're hoping that through producing genuinely great, well-crafted works of art, that people, no matter where they are in the world, will find something beautiful to encounter and be transformed by it. And we hope finally to make, however small, a deposit in the great treasury of culture that the church has built up for the last 2 millennia. So to kick us off with just maybe a small coin in that treasury, Joshua is going to read to us from his new novel, Infinite Regress. And if there's any time left over, I might come up in a few minutes. So welcome, Joshua.
Thank you so much, James. And yeah, just sit back because the novel's about 300 pages, so we'll be here for a while. And I just wanted to briefly including two things, including the fact that many evenings when I meet students over Zoom, because we have students all over the country, I forget that this is mediated by the conversations are so extraordinary. The caliber and commitment is so rare. It's happening on a scale that I couldn't possibly fathom. And so it's incredible to just feel as I could reach out and touch from students from their states or even an ocean away. And then finally, just to that point about students being an ocean away, one of my best students is living in Dublin, Ireland, and she has children, and she's been longing for a program such as this for so long that she's making the sacrifice of putting the children to bed or sleeping for 3 hours, getting up to attend a 3-hour class twice a week, and contributing at the highest level for 3 hours, then going back to sleep for 3 hours to take care of all that needs to be done. And so it's just profoundly food to beyond possibly fathom. So this novel, Infinite Regress, tracks a young man named Blake York, who he graduated from a fictional Catholic university, which is more of a kind of post-Catholic, Catholic in name kind of university. And he's imbibed a lot of ideology and radical notions, but he's also acquired a large student debt. A heavy price has been paid for those radical ideas. And so he's been moving from dead-end job to dead-end job, working in the Bach and oil fields in Dakota, and doing everything that he can also to kind of keep abreast from his family, who he's estranged from, largely because of the ideas that he has imbibed. And so I'm just going to read from the beginning, and this is he sort of, one of his professors, was a defrocked priest who was hired back in Catholic school, has made a very unsavory proposition to him as a means of helping pay off his loans. If he were to undertake this deed, it would require a kind of testing of his professor's ideas. So he's haunted by this possibility and not yet ready to complete it. Just to give a brief sort of trajectory of where the novel goes without ruining it, he does end up more than less kind of following through on this very disturbing proposition. In the process, his family catches word of his desperate straits, and they're very dysfunctional, but they try to kind of rally what they can put together to help him. And their efforts are, I guess, too little too late, but to stop him from doing this thing. But nonetheless, it brings them some measure of reconciliation. It's a family for this faith, second faith. Blake York paced and paced the garret planks that did not creak, tiptoed slow not to wake those beneath, light of step over scattered nail heads he had meant to hammer flush into the floor, but deferred into the future, of course, like every good thing he had meant to do. Butcher paper stuck to his soles. No, the paper mache of the student loan notice he'd scattered with frostbite hands. The butcher snoring his lamb bleats below. Blake stopped at the window, nose against the glass, to stare down his last graveyard shift. The sweet scent of treated cedar. A northern lodestar rivaled the moon. An impossible loon sang for the lonely. Discontent with Wisconsin winter, the birds had migrated months ago, but there again, that melancholy croon, companion in the night's narrow hours. A beautiful pinpoint, too far, too bright, he rubbed his temples. That living dead light, then pulled the drapes and the light bulb string and inhaled the bouquet of baby's breath his sister Dymphna had sent by mail. A nosegay of 100 dried white stipples, minuscule stars swelling an envelope that he checked again and again for money. Empty. The black packet held nothing more. A sketch of their father and a promise, prayers, and these babies' breaths paled by heady moonlight. No mention of her own state, Dymphna, whether they'd found a way to heal her heart murmur. He yanked the drapes so hard they'd ricocheted open, and ricocheted sunshine illumined the room from the moon. In the cartoon sketch done in charcoal, Dad was Auguste Rodin's The Thinker, barely balanced on top of a ladder, brooding knuckles propping up a brain. A circular rum stain in the corner of the paper blurred the just legible words to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. Blake shut his eyes and kissed Dad's mind, emptied his lungs with a long breath, and let his shoulders go all the way slack. His smile commandeered them back to attention, pinched and rigid as if in pain. Not a smile, a twitch upon the lips. Not as bad as that syndrome Tourette's, what they once thought Dad had. For weeks, Blake had deferred not only loans, but a decision, the proposition. It wasn't, was it, about the pinch of unpaid debt, the old song of student loans? Though I'm not for nothing eating cheap eggs and white bread only, maybe navy beans and weak black tea for weeks for nothing. Defaults had brought his unpaid balance to $48,373. All he had to do to get that same amount paid into his account he knew was to go to bed with hate. But that tightrope tossed figure alone wouldn't decide the question. What he really needed, and badly, decidedly, was to save himself from the hangover fairy tale of his mother's faith, to trespass the tired and desperate moralities with their phobic protection against ambiguity, and to wake the next morning, still living for all his supposed sins. Not only to wake, but to do so on a strange bed, soft red comforter hugging his nakedness, his face mirrored back from the gorgeous vanity of an immovable mahogany dresser, looking down like a Borgia Pope, altogether benign in appearances. From between two stacks of ungraded papers, his own smile granting what needed absolution. A pleased smile, not a twitch, all the world at peace, finding nothing finally that needed forgiveness. But first he needed a matching pair of socks. Nerve twitch chills coming up through the heels, nail heads not flush with the floor. He stretched a brown woolen one over cold toes and, failing to find its sibling, settled for a red one that badly needed mending. His sister Dymphna loved doing that sort of thing, knitting. A nervous tick, he alleged, in an insane house, or maybe love, or what you know. Brown and red, a garish clash. Not a matter of what people might think. The colors simply didn't agree. Blake York, you're kidding me. As if anything can't be reconciled, finally. Won't be, depending on from where you look. Pulling out a pen whose cheap ink glistened like the feathers of a slickened midnight raven, Blake rambled, half audibly mouthing the syllables of the letter he was writing to his sister. A letter that regretted aloud the end of his short-lived career as security officer at Sacred Heart Cemetery in Nowhere, Wisconsin. These beautiful gravestones, he wrote, especially somehow the oldest ones, the ones you couldn't read to save your life. His breath hung heavy. Strangled language disappeared into silence before he unknotted and distended it again. The gravestones are gray, but not dreary, not at all. Almost, is that the right word? Almost noble. The splotched gray and green and blackened ones too, charred by the Peshtigo fire so long ago, more than enduring. Why is it that walking between the graves, I came close to some sort of calm, rest? But isn't it just like a Yorick to abandon the scene at the very second you approximate peace? I swear I would stay here if I had the money, but no matter how many raises I could conjure from good behavior, these little paychecks for cemetery security could not kill the student debt. Dymphna, I'll find you when I'm back in the city. I just can't talk to Dad right now. I will, though. But first, something big needs to be done. I need you to figure out something super important. And no one can help me, not even you. The map of his travels left him dizzy, and yet he knew he'd never remain in one place as long as another untried city offered the sanctuary of anonymity. He had applied for cemetery security as a kind of desperate jest after his stint in the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota became unbearable. Recognizing the gains that would come from his reckless work ethic, the oil company had awaited Blake's acclimation to the inhospitable conditions. Frozen feet, third shift, plains winds that mocked your parka. In the break room, mid-shift, an Obama blurred by bad TV reception linked the BP oil spill with terrorism. Abroad, he said, our brave men and women in uniform are taking the fight to Al-Qaeda wherever it exists. And tonight, I've returned from a trip to the Gulf Coast to speak with you about the battle we're waging against an oil spill that is assaulting our shores and our citizens. Blake tried to see his new work as a way to wean the country from endless wars. The company, Fracking America, had kept him drill-side even when blinking against the marmalade thumbnail of the sun, licking his lips for a breakfast that didn't come. He drowsed and lost hold of the pressurized sprayers, sending up water like a frenzied Dionysus of the plains. Reckless in every direction. Before hands fumbling to shut off the nozzle, he shot Mick in the face. Mick, the middle-aged father of four, was a veteran of the fields, a veteran of other unspoken skirmishes, often as they stood there keeping the oil wells company. Mick would stare down the horizon and shake his head, a silly, almost stupid smile, like a child's, though every time Blake caught him, he would balk, adjust his belt, and get serious. Blake, who had wrestled down the serpentine sprayer, looked up at Mick's blank face. The punishing winds had reddened his skin to the color of ripe and bitter radishes. Mick licked his lips, looked at Blake and said, I should have sent you to hell, kid. The new rig up north. They're desperate for bodies, and the foremen are drunk enough to take this kind of shit. But I've been trying to place you all this time. It's hard, see? You're just like my son from my first marriage and spitting image, sheepish, pathetic looking, lost like. But there's something there, though what it is I couldn't tell you if I tried. Just fetch me about 5 of them hot packs and help me hold them on my face, would you? Son of a. Then we got to get back to it. Boss will be by in 20 minutes and I need you to wake up, look sharp, all right? Okay. The incident, which had happened 3 days into the job, made Blake hyper-vigilant. After that, his hands had stayed steady. Having made it through January, he was ready to reach for June, which would have offset his student loans for 5 good years. But after a double shift, in the early hours of a Sunday, a limping man who reeked of stale menthol and cheap hot beer had stuck a knife next to Blake's spine, muttered something about the man who ratted out my brother, man. I'm telling you, man, I don't know about you, but I'm my brother's keeper, not a killer. And then, craning around and seeing Blake's face as if for the first time, he dropped the knife suddenly and shuffled down the steep stairwell that took you up to the Salvation Army shelter. Blake picked up the blade, traced it across his own body, and then threw it down in the direction of the fleeing man, clanking on the stairs. You can keep it, he yelled. The quiet that followed the clank and the clang slowed his pulse, and he let out, God. Squatting, holding his forehead against the dark cement steps, cooling, pointless to call the police, who ever since the oil boom were notoriously overtaxed with far more serious cases. But tomorrow he would leave, comb through the job boards, find work that would take him back to Wisconsin, if not yet home. He wasn't ready to return. Blake had been sleeping at the Salvation Army while he worked the Bakken. Hard work, but fast money. Cash to keep at bay the creditors who found him even there, sent past due bills he would read on his cot, tossing and turning under the naked light that you could not shut off manually. To avoid incidents, the house supervisor ordered that the bulb throb swell your sleepless eyes all the godforsaken night. Many of the men who migrated to Dakota found wait lists instead of work. And the Army had expanded their capacity, brushing up against the fire code. Violent altercations doubled as men piled into shared bunks, 4 and even 5 to a room. Hot plates and long underwear daily disappeared, and men kept their checks unsigned, wrapped in plastic sheaths around their necks. You could not breathe without inhaling a stranger's exhalations. Even before the blade against his back, others had made knives of their eyes. In the night, disillusioned by what they found there, or maybe by whatever had squeezed them into coming here. What started then as a jest, how wanted cemetery security, led him to a new quietude, the raw and restless solitude of rural life. So different than the crowds that magnified your loneliness, that perpetual strangeness of city anonymity never being known. On the quietest nights, I'm skipping ahead. On the quietest nights, fluorescent torch staked into the soil. Blake went so far as to clean the dark green lichen from the stone inscriptions, so old that there were no grandchildren left to come and make known the names of the dead. He bought a dental tartar scraper at the dollar store and scratched at the plaque with great patience, repeating the names of those passed, terrified sometimes when the letters lost legibility, even after he cleaned them, disintegrated into garbled symbols that seemed to mean nothing to him. Like a foreign alphabet learned long ago, but now cut off from memory. He had to blink to figure out whether the confusion was on the stone's end or in his head. Ever since the Salvation Army knife had made a red notch below his left rib, these confusions had been coming a couple times a day. An ache, as if the brain were inflamed. Not merely migraines, but maybe something encephalitic, seemed the word, swollen and pulsing with pain that could stall and leave him scared, like a Halloween child lost in a corn maze. Scraping the graves was a good distraction. The way they spoke of nursing home citizens, something to make the time pass, to keep them busy. At some points, bent over a ruin, he'd not know what was lost. When he knew meaning was supposed to be happening, he scraped with fiercer devotion. If the elderly graves threatened to blur and fade their inhabitants, even the homogeneous slabs of the freshly deceased fared little better. Sunken just below the surface, chiseled lettering filled with soil. All except the alabaster angel residing over the entire cemetery, whose cheeks puffed out like the jazz trumpeter who played nightly at lost notes, still blowing at 2 a.m., low tones that bellowed below a woman's accompanying hum. Now tell me, do you have the time to pine? You know not the hour, and neither do I, but baby, don't you seem to mind. You don't know who I am, and nor do I. All you know is once upon a time, I was alive. And even the unnamed graves seemed to sway to this music, then rest their headstones from all stubborn striving, then rest. His supervisor, Sven's main work was groundskeeping for a convent whose glass windows gathered the dusk's subdued orange and gave it back golden. The concrete convent hovered over them like a hermit stuck on the hill. In the heady shadow of that misshapen creature with the great orange eyes, his manager had tried to prepare him to explain to, it almost seemed, talk him out of taking the job. To be honest, Sven said, I don't even know if we'll have graveyards like this in 20 years. Nearly no one visits for mourning. To most, this place isn't, visiting the dead is for most depressing. And then there's a real push for cremation on account of the environmental toil that comes with caskets, the old school kind, so much wood and steel. Urns, too, pose problems, at least the way things are done now. Burning bodies bring pollutants. Not to mention the burial rates will be something like 40% decline in the next 2 decades just because we'll have, less people. The point is, all you need to do is keep the place safe for the few who find it meaningful. You'd ever wait tables? Well, we do have our regulars, just like any restaurant. And none of what I say will affect you unless you plan to make this a lifelong career. We still have a good 10 years of sustainable business ahead of us. Some of us think that all these trends could see a serious correction when people see what it's like, what life is like without probabilities. As the weeks passed, Sven's dour slant didn't let up. He stood on a heap of declines and seemed to crow, a rooster on a dunghill, of which there were many in Lac-de-Flambeau, Wisconsin. His sallow humor and sardonic fists against fate were tied up with his long devotion to the place. The clunky, brutalist castle had beds for 100 nuns, but only 7 of them were slept in now, and 2 of the 7 sleepers dwelt in hospice. One had received last rites several times, and a younger nun, habit so long it hid her feet, soldiering a shovel over her shoulder, had already opened a hole in the earth, a rained-on space that Blake looked into, inhaling that fresh soil smell so strong, as if the worms were incensing the graves for Sister Mary Edith. Listening to Sven, Blake ached, looking at his watch, wanted to walk away, but sensed this man needed it as a place of deposit for his dour. Maybe he'll yell less at someone else, Blake said to himself. If he had been born, if he were, say, this man's son, the train ticket would be in the mail, tethered neither to this place nor to this person. He could watch the collapse without feeling its weight. Still, Blake diverted his eyes when Sven came tinkering around, always with the faint brush of purple under his eyes. Sven looked like a man who slept under and not on top of his mattress. According to the official description, the daily work was mostly made of 5-mile-per-hour cruises around the figure-8 gravel path, an infinity of passings, an endless 8 that gave the overcrowded land its form. It was just a matter of doing this surreptitiously for 8 hours, now and then hanging a high-voltage flashlight out the window to where the dark spaces conspired to betray their mysteries to him, or maybe to keep their secrets.
Thanks for Joshua. It's exciting to hear this for the first time. I presume you. So, let's just see. Conviviality afterwards. We don't have a place yet in the curriculum for the program for Socrates' great story, but that's Feast. But if you haven't read that story, go home and do so. And if you don't have a copy of it, I can provide you one to see. But it teaches you everything you need to know about it. So I faced with the prospect of facing you all this evening. I had 2 goals in mind. One was to read exclusively from my most recent book of poems, The Strangeness of the Good, because though it was a book that was written during quarantine and in fact largely about quarantine, maybe I should have known that I was not going to get a whole lot of opportunities to do a book tour for this this book. So I'm going to punish you for that and make you the recipients of the book tour for The Strangest of the Good. But I also this is a book that in many ways is about the reckoning that we all face in middle age with both the good things we've been given, but also the compromises and even the risk of losing those good things that we think are so secure. And so it's broken down. You know, to my mind, one of the central poems is one called First Day of School After Christmas, which is about walking to school with my daughter. Please don't leave me. As she's heading into adolescence. And I think that's a theme, those reckonings with possible disappointment is a big theme of the book. But another one is actually not about reckonings with middle age, but about discovering how to be in the world and how to be fully human in the world. And so I think actually some of the lessons that I gleaned and find that were in this poem have something to say about our ambitions in this program. So I thought I'd select just those poems that spoke to that. So here's a good first instance, a poem called Those Days of Weighted Solitude, which hearing a poem for the first time, it's often hard to get right into it. So it's always helpful to get a couple sentences of introduction. And for this one, it's just a blank verse meditation on an experience that many of us have had, which is being the one lonely undergraduate who wakes up on Sunday and goes to mass. The insecurity and the doubt that haunts me in those footsteps. Those days of weighted solitude. What one remembers is the autumn leaves, the quiet avenues of Sunday morning weighed down beneath a quilt of rust and gold, and passing by the large neglected houses, their porches slanting with locked bikes and couches and occupants asleep still, having leased another hour till a headache stirred them. One felt the world as still and damp and sad. Along these ways I dragged myself, head bowed, the leaf bed softening my steps to silence, but bowed as well beneath the gravity my weekly pilgrimage had taken on. To hear the back door latch as it fell closed upon the darkness of the drowsing house, and feel that solitude bear down on me with absent weight as I went off alone to mass. A few blocks down, the little church with blunted turrets built of golden brick, the shade of fallen leaves, and peaked with domes whose round tops balanced each a crucifix. I bore not just a sense of loneliness, but sorrow and remorse, and would have gone alone in any case, ashamed to share with anyone this walk of half belief, this sense of contradicting not the world, but rather all the world that dwelt within me. So also, in the inner chapel's darkness, I'd sit alone tucked in some pew's far corner, amid the surge of families crowded in, their hymnals clattering downward with a thump, while some child squirming at his father's shoulder raised up at last a high and ceaseless wail. I mouthed each prayer as if about to. I'd think of the apostles in their room, locked away with a wound of fear and failure, and it would seem that I was there with them to pour out words at what had come to pass in each of us. We did not understand, but only could confess the sense we bore. Then, heading back again down that same path, the Eucharist a dry taste in my mouth, a sting upon my brain still heated me. I'd wonder when this thing I had to do might seem less brittle. Would there come a time I'd speak with golden tongue of all that glory, or it not seem a glimmer swamped by darkness? A time when every movement ceased to play at parables about some inner mood. I did not know that there would be whole years where neither grief nor joy could pound my chest, and prayer came forth in one clean line of words that carried nothing with it but its meaning. The church itself seemed bathed in neutral light, my soul insensible in its detachment. We do not always know when we've been blessed. So that's a poem about the solitude of devotion, of this great, not an institution, but a body of Christ to go to, and yet the solitude that so many people experience as they're making their lonely way to church. And it's a walking poem, and I have to do another walking poem because, as several people here will know in our graduate program, we just read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And I made a point of pointing out that how Joyce in that novel and in his later novel Ulysses, the whole novel is just about walking. And I think that's one of the things, in fact, it's one of the most powerful things that Joyce as an author has taught me is the strange way in which walking is everything. The randomness, the non-event of walking is a way of being in the world. And so as it happens, when I, as a student, I used to live in Dublin every summer, and I would walk the same path that Stephen Dedalus and James Joyce took on their way to the Catholic University of Ireland, which Cardinal Newman had founded half a century before Joyce studied there, century and a half before I was there. And in fact, I would walk Stephen Dedalus's path, come out in a park, and there's a bust of James Joyce right there. And then I would cross the street and enter into this building where Cardinal Newman had taught, where Gerard Manley Hopkins lived, where Joyce himself had studied. I have to offer just one more bit of commentary. As everybody who knows that book knows, it's really a story about a journey of kind of meandering or walking away from faith into a secular world. And as I would take that path, I always thought, so this is a poem about walking back. Its title is a line from Joyce. Every morning he hallowed himself. While still a student, wandering abroad, but lodged in Dublin for a long July, I'd pass each day through King Street with a sigh, dismissing all I couldn't afford as fraud. I'd reach the busy end of Grafton Street and join its host of tourists on their way beneath the Fusiliers' arch, in fanned retreat into the green beyond, and there delay before bronze statues set along the path to figure those who'd felt the empire's wrath. My daily route would bridge the small lake's heart and come out just beside the bust of Joyce, where we would listen to that clamorous voice which formed a sentence from each place and part. The vulgar hawking wares, the verdant growth surrounding those immortalized in loss, and who spoke only through a die-cast oath that made on history's text a marginal gloss. The narrow gate, where branching birch and lime gave shade like Marvell's garden out of time. And then, before the stoop-browed church of brick that Newman built, scrunched in between a pair of Georgian homes, I'd silence thought for prayer and leave behind the mind's desultory tick. Stray images from Mehan, lines from Yeats, some thought of Maritans I couldn't decide the sense of. These were left with other freights, the future's dark or past wounds to my pride, as if they dropped within the postbox there before I'd mount the lion's century stair. Once in the college's memorial pool, I'd take the narrow staircase at the rear, where Hopkins muttered once in self-sunk drear, where Joyce had tramped with martyr, crank, and fool, and Newman raised his cassock round the knee to climb as I did, marking each flight's turn with prayer before each statue that he'd see. The minds lit incense, pausing there to burn, for Joseph, Mary, and at last the Lord, that soul and body rise with one accord. How callow it must seem, that first attempt to measure out my days as if they were some liturgy whose borrowed form might moor a life adrift, misshapen and unkempt. We pass so absently from phase to phase, I know, that conscious disciplines seem vain. But even now it sets my heart ablaze to see that young man bow to foreign reign. With him, I, older and unruly still, would have my will reordered to his will. That poem has another distinction that makes it first in my heart, and it's the most complicated stanza. It's a 10-line, 10-line rhyme stanza. Someday I'll tie Spencer into an 18-line stanza, but not this year. So those are kind of angsty poems about solitude and seeking institutions and an order of the self. Sometimes, of course, in fact, most of the time, we actually find one. The poem from which the title of my book, The Strangest of the Good, comes is the one I want to read from you now, Through the Water, which is a poem that had a curious origin. I was given a commission by a magazine to write a poem for an issue they were going to publish on baptism. And I waited until 2 weeks past the deadline when I happened to be standing in the shower, the water raining down on my head. And I thought, oh, I wrote this poem in about 5 minutes. I wish I could have done it 3 weeks earlier. But anyhow, but it's a poem about those of you who know your St. Augustine. That baptism means what it means, of course, but it's also such a vision of that portal that we're asked to cross into mystery pretty much every day of our lives, that we do sometimes out in childhood and sometimes in the fullness of the sacrament. And you'll get a sense of what I mean. Through the water. Far back within the mansion of our thought, we glimpse a lintel with a door that's shut, and through which all our lives would seem to lead, though we feel powerless to say toward what. It is the place where all the shapes we know give way to whispers in a gnawing gut. And so, in childhood, we will duck beneath the waterfall into a hidden cove. In summer, pass within a stand of pines, cut off from those bright fields in which we rove, whose needles lay a softening bed of silence, and great boughs tightly weave a sacred grove. When winter settles in and our skies darken, we take a trampled path by pond and wood, and find beneath an arch of slumbering thorn straight tufts of fur, a skull stripped of its hood. Then turn and look down through the thickening ice in wonder at the strangeness of the good. And Peter, falling through that plain where he had only cast his nets before, and where behemoth stalked in darkest depths that sank and sank as if there were no floor. He cried out to the wind and felt a hand that clutched and bore his burden back to shore. We know that we must fall into such waters, must lose ourselves within their breathless power until we are raised up, hair drenched, eyes stinging, by one who says to us that from this hour we have passed through. We're dead, but have returned, and are a new creation from the flower. So one of the challenges of, I guess, being a Catholic writer in our day is to figure out how to show that it's part of life, and that it informs life. In fact, it's one of the things that I think a lot of people fail to do. They manage to show the strangeness of it, but not that the strangeness enters into you and transforms the daily life around you. I remember complaining about a particular name her, because all of her poems were, trying to imagine the incarnation like a surgical glove being put over your right hand, and just, yeah, that's true. Interesting. But the real transformation of the Eucharist is the way in which it transforms us into a new creation. And to be a new creation means to be part of a new world, to be something different than you were before, and to live that vocation, that kind of being out in daily life. And so, strangely enough, one of the great goods that came from the quarantine was I was sitting in my study one afternoon thinking about a friend of ours who just returned from Milan, where his father had died on the last flight out of Italy before they closed down the country. And I just thought, I want to write about this. In fact, I want to write about everything that's happening in our country right now. I want to write a poem that basically the newspaper in like verse. And so I see Katie Carl to my right. So thankfully, somebody who happens to be editor of a very good magazine said, yeah, we'll publish that. And so I began writing a long chronicle called The Quarantine Notebook, where I just detailed our shared experience, our collective experience, both public and private, the way in which so many events were being both affecting all of us together, and the way in which our private lives were converging with our public lives in these brilliant, strange rhymes. Lest you think me a sentimentalist, I didn't mean that we were all coming together and getting along. That's obviously not true. We've never been farther apart. But isn't it a marvelous mystery that we've never been so estranged from each other than when we have actually more in common than we've probably ever had in the history of our country? Make of that what you will. So I wanted to share just this one poem from April 15th, 2020. The great blessing for the Wilson household quarantine was that I finally got all the kids riding bikes. And here, my friends, is the fruit of my labor, and it was so good that it involves the pseudo-Dionysius. Let's see what I mean. April 15th, 2020. The children whirl in circles round me there, Axis and father of them all, their bikes humming against cold air, the flash of wheels ripping about the empty parking lot outside the shuttered public library. The only person who intrudes upon their endless free procession, one old man who comes each day and plugs his laptop in with an extension cord, its long orange line led snake-like to an outlet in the stone. He sits there in his car's back seat, a door cracked to admit the power, his white head ignoring us and bent in concentration, as if pure thought turned in upon itself. But he should see how those kids whip their way in narrow, then in greater orbits flying, as do the hosts of feathered seraphim, formed rank on rank, enclosed in brilliant wings, and giving of their plenitude, they circle from greater to the lesser, so that all share in the splendor of the sourceless font, that boundless wheel of light which kindles all. Such ecstasy and glory have they found in their but recently acquired balance. They coast within a haze of radiance. Beyond us stretch the baseball fields, their backstops heavy and dull with chain-linked uselessness, the diamonds scribbled through with dirt bike tracks, and just along the margin of the wood, the playground we have named for Narnia sits idle, swings and jungle gym, both wrapped in orange police tape, snapping back and forth, caught in the fitful gusts of April wind. Just out of sight, still other circles narrow. The nesting of a man into his lounger, a case of light spread open like a mouth beside the leg rest handle. On the set, an episode recorded some years back shows someone spin the wheel and cry out, "Oh." A woman, frail and shrunken in her blouse, has freshened up her tight perm with a pick, but let it drop back gently on the couch, her breath grown shallow, slow to sleep descends. And in the early morning, fathers pace with bloodshot, angry eyes, the children yelling and crowding one another at the sink, the basins thick with aqua streaks of paste that cling beneath the cold gush jetting downward. And somewhere, someone's mother chips a nail trying to clean the juice and crumbs that hide within the wrinkled padding of a high chair. And someone locked inside a studio whose heart is racing with the boredom, reels eyes from phone to book to alley window. While in the paper, blotches pullulate and overlap upon a printed map, like an old stack of tiddlywinks we've scattered. Our dogwoods now stand prim with pinkish flowers, the maple in the side yard bulging clusters, while apple and magnolia shed last petals and skirts that radiate about their trunks. But even now, the season's gripped with chill, and I find twisting on the air a few stray flurries wend their pointless journey down, as if to warn us all that comes to pass will be turned back upon itself in time, however much time seems one long, straight line. And in this spiraling about an axis, we may see fate, but fate has its own order, and order brings with it a kind of freedom, as Thomas proves when he repeats each arc about the lot, as if it were a cosmos, that place of churning planets, winding stars and singing angels covering their eyes, his cycle racing wild, its spinning pageant, so fast I hardly note the trepidations. So it was such a strange thing that I wrote this long quarantine notebook poem thinking that I had summed up the state that our country was in 2020. And no sooner had it been finished and the last part of it was published than it suddenly felt entirely out of date as our cities were set aflame. And so I reluctantly wrote one final poem that constitutes its own final section in the book called When. Leave you this great thought. When noisome crowds turn out to flood the beach, and with their flesh despoil all in reach. When some boy burns his hand and squeals with pain, only to touch it to the stove again. When waiting for a carousel at the park, you see pale tattooed bodies purple dark. when this drunk stranger brags with all his force about his past adulteries and divorce? Will you look on it all just as you should, and in that sordid wreckage find the good? When you turn over leaves upon the vine, where lantern flies cling gorging each veined line, when great winds shake the trees and cut the power, leaving you in the darkness of the hour, when in the nursing home your mother dies, cut off from muttered prayers and useless cries, when every argument begets a roar and every careless thought erupts in war, will you maintain what was once understood, that even now the world as such is good? And when they hunt him through the soaking heat, to leave him crumpled on a bloody street, and when behind calmed eyes he seems to gloat and press his weight down on another's throat, and when you see them standing calmly there, indifferent as his last word dies in air, and when the glass is cracked, the streets aflame, with no word spoken but that burning name, will you stand as the Lord of all once stood, and somehow say that things are very good? Thank you. So let me just say on behalf of Joshua and myself, we're so grateful for you all being here today for this tonight for this official launch of the program, which we're so thrilled to be given the chance to begin. I want to ask you all to join us for some conviviality and a lot of food, way more food than I was anticipating. And then also for those of you who have the time to spare, tomorrow back here at 12:30, we're going to just have an informal session about the Master of Fine Arts program, mostly intended for students who might be curious about studying the program, but all are welcome. And who knows, there might be a spontaneous poetry reading that will not in any way resemble beatniks. So welcome. Thank you.
Just one more thing, if MFA students, if you're here, if you could all come up, we're just going to get one group photo before we lose you.